The chamber lights glared like spotlights on a stage, bathing the polished desks and restless lawmakers in a hard, almost theatrical glow. Cameras clicked in rapid bursts, catching every tightened jaw and impatient glance. Then, cutting through the low murmur of side conversations, Senator Tim Scott leaned forward with the smooth confidence of a man certain the room belonged to him. His voice carried across the marble floor sharp, rehearsed, and dripping with condescension as he aimed a carefully sharpened attack straight at Representative Jasmine Crockett. Gasps rippled through the gallery before his words even settled. Staffers froze mid-keystroke, reporters leaned in, and the chamber itself seemed to hold its breath. Scott's challenge wasn't just a policy jab, it was a public dare meant to corner a rising progressive voice and remind her, and everyone watching, who supposedly held the upper hand. Across the aisle, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Under the harsh lights, her expression remained calm, almost serene, the quiet counterpoint to Scott's theatrical thrust. Her eyes tracked him with the measured focus of someone who has weathered storms far rougher than a Senate scolding. Where he sought to dominate, she embodied poise, a silent promise that truth could not be bullied into submission. The silence after his remark stretched long enough for the tension to become a living thing. Viewers across America, watching on live streams and news feeds, felt the collective tightening of the moment. It wasn't just another political spat, it was the clash of two Americas, one clinging to old hierarchies, the other daring to rise. Crockett drew a slow breath. A faint, knowing smile curved at the edges of her lips. Those who caught it felt a spark of anticipation ignite inside them, the instinctive recognition that something unforgettable was about to break loose. But before she spoke, before a single syllable of her response reached the air, the room itself seemed to lean forward. No one in the chamber, no one watching across the country, knew that within seconds a single sentence would slice through years of political bravado and rewrite the balance of power. No one knew that one question, one perfectly timed clapback, was about to change everything. Long before Tim Scott's voice sliced through the chamber, the air in Washington had been thick with tension. The 2025 election cycle loomed like a thunderstorm on the horizon, and with it came a familiar, exhausting spectacle, the GOP's well-worn strategy of dismissing progressive voices while projecting unshakable confidence. In committee hearings and press briefings, Republican leaders treated questions of justice and equity as nuisances, waving them off with polished smiles and hollow sound bites. They spoke of unity while pushing bills that divided, boasting of strength while sidestepping the pain of everyday Americans. For months, that arrogance had gone largely unanswered, at least in the marble halls where cameras rarely linger. But beneath the surface, frustration was boiling. Activists filled town halls demanding action on voting rights and immigration reform. Families struggling with housing and healthcare watched as partisan games turned their futures into bargaining chips. The gap between the people and their supposed representatives had become a chasm, and the stakes of every debate felt heavier than the scripted banter suggested. It was into this fraught atmosphere that Jasmine Crockett stepped, carrying not just her own resolve but the weight of countless unheard voices. A freshman congresswoman with a reputation for fearless questioning, she was an easy target for those who believed seniority equaled supremacy. To the GOP, she was the perfect foil, young, progressive, unapologetically proud of her identity. They thought they could brush her aside the way they had brushed aside so many others. Tim Scott's attack was more than a personal slight, it was the embodiment of a party strategy, one designed to intimidate and neutralize. By questioning her credibility, he aimed to remind the country who held the microphone and who was expected to remain silent. It was a calculated move meant to reinforce a hierarchy that had long defined American politics, seasoned men delivering verdicts while newcomers waited their turn. But Crockett's presence in that chamber was proof that the old playbook was wearing thin. Every camera trained on her represented millions of viewers who had grown tired of being patronized. Her supporters, immigrants, working-class families, young voters, weren't just watching for entertainment. They were watching for a sign that someone inside those walls still believed in truth, justice, and representation. That is why this confrontation mattered. It wasn't simply a verbal skirmish between two politicians, it was a proxy battle for the soul of American democracy. If Crockett faltered, it would feed the narrative that power belongs only to those who already hold it. But if she stood her ground, even a single sentence could shift the momentum, proving that courage can puncture even the most polished facade. And so, as the room braced for her reply, the stakes felt larger than one exchange or one news cycle. This was about dignity for the silenced, accountability for the powerful, and a chance, however brief, to remind the nation that words still matter. But what Jasmine unleashed next would ripple far beyond Capitol Hill, igniting conversations in living rooms, classrooms, and city squares across America and sending a shockwave through a party that believed itself untouchable. To understand the tension that erupted in that chamber, you have to understand the man who fired the first shot. Senator Tim Scott had spent years perfecting a brand of politics that blended polished charm with steely ambition. He projected the image of a bridge builder, a soft-spoken statesman who could appeal to moderates while carrying the banner of a party that had grown increasingly combative. On camera, he smiled easily and spoke of common-sense solutions, sprinkling his speeches with words like unity and opportunity. To many casual observers, he seemed the very picture of civility in a bitterly divided era. But beneath the calm exterior lay a careful calculation. Scott had built his career on navigating two worlds, presenting himself as a voice of inclusion while voting in lockstep with a GOP agenda that often left vulnerable communities behind. He spoke warmly of lifting working families, yet supported tax cuts that tilted toward the wealthy. He praised the importance of voting rights in lofty speeches, even as he backed measures that made it harder for marginalized citizens to cast a ballot. His public remarks celebrated diversity, but his legislative record told a different story: opposition to key immigration reforms, resistance to police accountability bills, and quiet alignment with party leaders determined to stall progressive change. These contradictions were not accidents. They were the very foundation of his strategy. By offering polite rhetoric while reinforcing entrenched power structures, Scott positioned himself as untouchable, too courteous to be called extreme, too loyal to challenge the status quo. Within the GOP, he was praised as proof that the party could present a friendlier face without sacrificing hardline priorities. Outside it, his carefully crafted image made critics hesitate, unsure how to pierce the armor of a man who seemed so reasonable. Yet that armor carried hairline fractures. Activists who tracked his votes saw the gap between his promises and his actions. Young progressives mocked the way he delivered speeches about opportunity while voting against student debt relief. Civil rights advocates bristled at his habit of condemning racism in broad terms while rejecting specific reforms to address it. Behind closed doors, even some Republican aides whispered that his genial persona was a mask for ruthless ambition. Scott understood the game. He wore his civility like a tailored suit, using it to disarm opponents and charm the press. In hearings, he leaned forward with an encouraging nod, even when dismissing a proposal outright. He framed objections as concerns, allowing him to reject ideas without appearing combative. To the untrained eye, it looked like statesmanship. To those on the receiving end, it felt like a velvet-gloved dismissal, more infuriating than open hostility. That day in the chamber, this carefully cultivated facade was on full display. Scott delivered his jab with a courteous smile, his tone measured and almost gentle, as if he were offering advice rather than delivering a calculated insult. It was the kind of move he had executed countless times, enough to lull opponents into caution, to make them second-guess whether calling it out would seem overly aggressive. He counted on that hesitation. It was the invisible advantage that had carried him through countless confrontations unscathed. But the country had changed since his early days in office. Outside the Capitol, a new generation of voters had grown impatient with politeness that masked injustice. They were done mistaking charm for character. And among them rose leaders like Jasmine Crockett, leaders unwilling to bow to the unwritten rules of deference. Scott didn't see it coming. As he leaned back after his remark, confident he had framed the narrative and left his opponent cornered, a faint ripple passed through the gallery. It was the subtle shift that precedes an earthquake, a warning that the ground beneath his carefully balanced persona was about to give way. And just when Scott thought he controlled the narrative, a freshman congresswoman shattered it all. Long before Jasmine Crockett walked into the Capitol with the quiet confidence of a seasoned fighter, she was a young woman standing at the edges of power, watching how decisions made in polished chambers could crush everyday lives. Her story is not the tale of a political dynasty or a gilded path to office. It begins in neighborhoods where opportunity was hard-won and justice often felt out of reach, where immigrant families hustled to make rent and single parents worked double shifts just to keep the lights on. Jasmine grew up seeing firsthand how policies debated in distant halls shaped the price of groceries, the quality of schools, and the dignity of work. Those early experiences planted a seed of urgency that would later drive every step of her journey. In her 20s, Crockett cut her teeth as a civil rights attorney, defending clients who couldn't afford the luxury of long legal battles. She walked into courtrooms where prosecutors underestimated her, where judges raised eyebrows at her sharp questions, and where the stakes were measured not in political points but in real lives: families facing eviction, immigrants threatened with deportation, young people brutalized by a system designed to intimidate them into silence. Each case hardened her resolve and taught her a skill that would one day electrify a congressional hearing: the art of staying composed while dismantling an opponent with precision. Grassroots organizers took notice. Long before television cameras found her, Crockett was a familiar face at late-night strategy sessions and dawn picket lines. She was the one who stayed after rallies to help clean up, the one who listened to elders recount decades of struggle and translated their lessons into action. Her advocacy wasn't a resume builder, it was survival. She fought for immigrant-friendly policies not as an abstract ideal but as a lifeline for neighbors and friends whose futures hung in the balance. Whether pushing for fair housing, equitable education funding, or humane immigration reform, she carried the stories of people who rarely made the evening news but whose lives defined the American promise. But the path was anything but smooth. There were campaigns she lost, proposals that were buried in committee, and long nights when allies warned her to slow down or play nice. Instead, she leaned into the fight. When critics mocked her relentless questioning during local hearings, she sharpened her arguments. When donors suggested softening her stance on immigration to attract more conservative voters, she doubled down on compassion and equity. Every confrontation became training: a masterclass in patience, strategy, and the power of a perfectly timed pause. That resolve came at a personal cost. Friends recall late nights when she returned from marathon meetings exhausted but unbowed, or the quiet moments when she wondered aloud whether the sacrifices: missed holidays, frayed relationships, constant travel were worth it. Yet every doubt was answered by the faces of the people she served: the mother clutching her child's eviction notice, the young dreamer praying for a chance to stay in the only country he had ever known, the factory worker who just wanted a fair wage. Their struggles became her compass, reminding her why retreat was never an option. When she finally stepped onto the national stage, Crockett carried more than her own ambition. She carried the weight of millions who had been told, in ways big and small, that their voices didn't matter. She knew what it meant to be underestimated by opponents who assumed her youth meant inexperience, by colleagues who mistook her poise for passivity, by pundits who reduced her to a headline rather than a movement. And she understood that every sharp exchange in a committee room was more than political theater: it was a chance to prove that dignity and truth still had a place in American politics. Her immigrant-friendly policies weren't just legislative goals, they were acts of recognition for families like the ones she grew up with. Families who built communities while enduring the daily indignities of being told they didn't belong. Her passion for marginalized voices wasn't a talking point, it was the echo of childhood friends who vanished into detention centers, of neighbors forced to pack up their lives overnight. Every bill she championed, every speech she delivered, carried the heartbeat of those stories. And it was precisely this history, this relentless preparation, that gave her the tools to face a seasoned operator like Tim Scott. Where others might have flinched under the spotlight, Jasmine had already weathered tougher storms. Courtrooms had taught her how to disarm opponents with surgical questions. Grassroots battles had trained her to channel outrage into clarity. The long nights of doubt had forged a composure that no camera could shake. So when Scott lobbed his carefully calibrated attack, Jasmine did not merely react, she executed. Every hard-fought campaign, every courtroom duel, every sleepless night spent strategizing had sharpened the blade she now carried. Her voice, steady and unyielding, was the sound of countless invisible battles converging in a single, decisive moment. And as the chamber waited for her reply, few realized that the words forming on her lips were not just a rebuttal to one senator, they were the culmination of a lifetime spent turning adversity into power. The air trembled with possibility, the kind that precedes an unexpected triumph. What came next would not only silence the room but send a shockwave far beyond Capitol Hill, proving that the underestimated can become unstoppable when history demands a reckoning. The chamber seemed to shrink as Tim Scott leaned forward, his voice sharpened to a lawyer's edge. He painted his words with practiced charm, but the intent cut clear, questioning Jasmine Crockett's credibility, framing her as a newcomer out of her depth. With all due respect, he began, the classic prelude to a verbal dagger, perhaps the congresswoman from Texas hasn't yet grasped the complexity of this issue. His smile was polite, his eyes carried the glint of someone certain he controlled the room. A low murmur rippled across the gallery. Staffers shifted in their seats. Cameras tightened their focus. Scott pressed on, layering his argument with statistics and anecdotes meant to box Crockett in, each sentence a reminder of his years in office and the relationships he wielded like armor. He invoked bipartisanship, hinted at her youthful zeal, and framed her policies as naive risks to the American dream. It was the kind of performance the GOP had perfected, polished, seemingly civil, but designed to make progressive voices look reckless. Crockett didn't flinch. She rested her hands lightly on the desk, her expression unreadable. When she answered, her tone was calm, almost gentle, but every word landed with deliberate weight. "Senator," she said, "complexity isn't an excuse for injustice. It's the reason we can't afford to ignore it." The simplicity of the line drew a collective breath from the crowd. Her composure cut through his theatrics like a scalpel through silk. Scott countered quickly, his voice rising half a notch. He accused her of grandstanding for cameras, of offering dreams without details. He rattled off budget numbers and border statistics, his rhythm quickening as he sought to reclaim the narrative. But each thrust met a steady parry. Crockett calmly dismantled his points one by one. Citing legislation he had opposed, community programs she had championed, and the real human stakes behind every data point. Her rebuttals weren't flashy, they were precise, surgical, and devastating. Gasps began to punctuate the air. A few heads in the audience nodded subtly toward Crockett. Even some reporters who had entered expecting a routine sparring session began exchanging looks of surprise. The tension rose like a tide, each exchange drawing the room closer to an unseen breaking point. Scott leaned in harder, his carefully polished civility slipping just enough to reveal a flicker of frustration. "You talk about justice," he said, the edge in his voice unmistakable, "but you ignore the law. You talk about representation, but you dismiss reality. Tell me, Congresswoman, how do you expect to lead when your proposals collapse under scrutiny?" Crockett's eyes locked onto his, steady as a mountain. She let the silence stretch just long enough for every camera to tighten its focus. Then, in a voice as controlled as it was unyielding, she answered, "By remembering that laws are meant to serve people, not the other way around." The chamber erupted in a mix of gasps and hushed exclamations. Scott opened his mouth to retort, but Crockett was already moving to her next point, connecting his voting record to the very hardships he claimed to oppose. Her words flowed like a quiet storm, unhurried, unstoppable. Each fact she laid down wasn't just a counterargument, it was a reminder of lived reality, of families and workers and immigrants whose struggles couldn't be reduced to sound bites. The audience leaned forward as if drawn by gravity. Staffers who moments earlier had been scrolling through phones now watched with rapt attention. Even Scott's allies exchanged wary glances, sensing a shift they couldn't quite name. And then it happened, a split-second pause. Crockett stopped speaking, her gaze fixed on Scott, her next words gathering like a thunderhead. The silence was electric, the kind that prickles across skin before lightning strikes. Every person in the chamber, ally, opponent, and onlooker alike, felt the weight of what was coming. In that breathless instant, time seemed to stretch. Scott straightened in his chair, bracing himself. The crowd held its collective breath. Everyone knew the exchange had reached its critical edge. But no one, not even Scott himself, could predict the precision of the strike Jasmine Crockett was about to deliver. The pause stretched long enough for hearts to race. Cameras tightened on Jasmine Crockett's face, capturing every fraction of her calm resolve. When she finally spoke, her voice cut through the chamber with a clarity that felt almost supernatural. "Senator Scott," she began, each syllable deliberate, "you speak of laws and order, yet you vote against the very protections that keep our people safe. You preach about opportunity, yet your record reads like a manual for locking doors on those who need them most." The first sentence landed like a tremor, the second shook the room. Scott's smile faltered, his polished confidence slipping into a half-second of disbelief. Viewers watching the live stream would later replay that micro-expression in countless memes, the flicker of a man realizing the ground beneath him was giving way. Crockett didn't rush. She let the silence between her words amplify their weight. "You claim complexity," she continued, "but complexity has never excused cruelty. It only demands courage." A gasp fluttered through the gallery. Phones lit up across the chamber as reporters thumbed frantic notes, sensing history in real time. Scott leaned forward, attempting a rebuttal, but Crockett's momentum was unstoppable. "When you vote against health care for struggling families, when you dismiss the voices of immigrants who built this nation, when you call justice a distraction," she said, her eyes locked on his, "you are not defending America, you are denying it." The room erupted in a low, electric murmur. Even some of Scott's allies froze, caught between loyalty and the undeniable precision of her indictment. Crockett raised a hand slightly, not to silence them, but to draw the chamber back into her gravity. "This is not about party," she said softly. "It is about people. And the people deserve better than empty smiles and hidden knives." Outside the chamber, the digital world ignited. Twitter feeds exploded with hashtags, hashtag Crockett clapback, hashtag truth in the room, hashtag mic drop moment. Clips of her opening salvo flooded TikTok within minutes, slowed down and set to dramatic music. Commentators scrambled to record instant reactions. "Did you see Tim Scott's face?" one tweet read, racking up tens of thousands of likes in seconds. Another simply posted a fire emoji alongside a screenshot of Scott's startled eyes. Back inside, Crockett pressed forward, her tone measured but unyielding. "You say my proposals collapse under scrutiny," she said, echoing his earlier challenge. "But I have walked the streets of communities your votes have abandoned. I have spoken with mothers who work 2 jobs and still can't afford a doctor. Their reality does not collapse. Their pain is not a talking point. It is America, and it demands action." Scott shifted in his chair, fingers tightening on the desk. He tried to interject, "Congresswoman," with respect, but his words collided with the growing wave of energy she commanded. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Each sentence fell like a perfectly aimed hammer. "Respect," she said, letting the word hang in the air. "Respect is earned by listening. Respect is earned by standing with those who have no lobbyists, no megadonors, no seat at the table. That is why I am here. That is why millions sent me to this chamber. To remind you that power without compassion is nothing but cruelty in a suit. The audience gasped, a sound both shocked and exhilarated. Some clapped before catching themselves. The chair gave a cautionary glance, but the energy in the room was unstoppable. A young intern in the back whispered to a colleague, "Did she just end his career in real time?" On social media, the narrative was already writing itself. Side-by-side clips of Scott's confident opening remarks and his current silent stare went viral. A trending TikTok audio looped Crockett's line, "Power without compassion is nothing but cruelty in a suit," over slow-motion footage of Scott blinking. Instagram stories flooded with captions like, "This is what representation looks like." Even late-night comedians were reportedly rewriting monologues before the vote had concluded. Crockett, still composed, delivered the final stroke. "Senator," she said, her voice now softer but more piercing than ever, "the laws we pass here are not abstractions. They decide whether a child eats, whether a family finds shelter, whether an immigrant mother lives without fear. If that complexity frightens you, then step aside for those of us willing to face it." Silence. Absolute, resonant silence. Scott opened his mouth again, but the words caught somewhere between thought and defense. He sat back, eyes narrowing in a forced smile that fooled no one. His fingers tapped an unconscious rhythm on the desk, a tell that every camera caught. Crockett let the quiet stretch, letting every person in the chamber absorb the shift. For a heartbeat, the space felt suspended outside of time. Then she concluded, almost gently, "This is our duty. This is our America. And no amount of polished rhetoric will change that truth." The gavel struck to signal the end of her allotted time, but the echoes of her speech outlasted the sound. Reporters rushed for the exits, their phones already buzzing with alerts. Outside, the hashtags climbed at breakneck speed. Cable networks cut into regular programming to replay the exchange. Commentators from both sides admitted, almost reluctantly, that something seismic had just occurred. Scott sat motionless, his once assured posture now a stiff silhouette against the chamber's marble backdrop. No overt humiliation passed across his face, but the subtle sag of his shoulders told the story better than any headline. He tried a tight smile toward the cameras, but it faltered under the weight of the moment. Meanwhile, Crockett gathered her notes with unhurried grace, as if she had merely spoken a necessary truth and nothing more. She gave a small nod to the chair, then turned to acknowledge the audience, her eyes shining with the quiet fire of someone who knows she has just shifted the ground beneath a nation's politics. In the digital ether, reactions multiplied. She didn't just answer him, she rewrote the debate, one viral tweet proclaimed. Another simply read, "Tim Scott just met his match." Even outlets known for partisan spin struggled to downplay the impact. Commentators debated whether this was a turning point for the 2025 legislative season, a moment when a freshman congresswoman exposed not only a senator's contradictions but the fragility of the old political order itself. As Crockett stepped back from the microphone, the chamber buzzed with the restless energy of a crowd that knew it had witnessed more than a debate. This was a recalibration. A reminder that truth, delivered with precision and courage, still carries the power to pierce even the most fortified walls of power. And just outside those walls, the nation waited, phones in hand, hearts still pounding for the aftershocks that were already beginning to ripple far beyond Capitol Hill. The gavel had barely struck before the first tremors of Jasmine Crockett's counterattack began rippling across the nation. Within seconds, phones throughout the chamber buzzed like an orchestra of alarms. Reporters dashed into hallways, broadcasting breathless updates. And on social media, a wildfire ignited. The hashtag Crockett clapback shot to the top of Twitter's trending list before the final echoes of her speech had faded. Close behind came hashtag Scott shattered, a blunt encapsulation of what millions had just witnessed. TikTok clips replayed the decisive lines, "Power without compassion is nothing but cruelty in a suit," slowed down and remixed over pulsing beats. Instagram feeds filled with screenshots of Tim Scott's frozen expression, Each meme sharper than the last. When you realize the freshman did her homework, read one viral caption. Cable news scrambled to catch up. Cheerons across networks screamed breaking, Crockett stuns Senate chamber with fiery rebuttal. Analysts who moments earlier predicted a quiet legislative session suddenly found themselves narrating a political earthquake. On MSNBC, a panelist declared, "This wasn't just a clapback. It was a masterclass in moral clarity." Even typically cautious outlets admitted that Scott had struggled to respond, a diplomatic phrase for what viewers knew had been a public unraveling. Celebrities added rocket fuel to the blaze. Pop icons tweeted fire emojis alongside clips of Crockett's speech. A-list actors reposted the video with captions like "This is leadership." Prominent athletes shared slow-motion edits to their millions of followers, framing the moment as a cultural touchdown. The effect was instant validation. What began as a congressional exchange had transformed into a pop culture event. Meanwhile, the GOP scrambled behind the scenes. Scott's communications team rushed to draft talking points that could contain the narrative. Anonymous staffers leaked to reporters that context was missing, but the explanation rang hollow. Every attempt to reframe the exchange only amplified Crockett's precision. By evening, party operatives huddled in private Slack channels, debating whether silence or counterattack would cause less damage. For everyday Americans, the impact cut deeper than viral entertainment. Immigrant families replayed Crockett's words at kitchen tables, feeling a rare recognition of their struggles. Young activists flooded group chats with messages of inspiration. "This is why we fight," one organizer wrote. Comment sections overflowed with gratitude from viewers who saw in her composure a reflection of their own perseverance. Progressive leaders seized the moment. Fundraising emails highlighted Crockett's fearless stand for truth, and small dollar donations poured in at a staggering pace. Within hours, her campaign reported a surge of new supporters, many first-time donors motivated by the viral speech. Commentators speculated that this single exchange could reshape the landscape heading into the 2025 election cycle, elevating Crockett from rising star to household name. Even late-night comedy shows pivoted to the story. Writers scrambled to add fresh punchlines. Tim Scott came for a debate and left with a free masterclass in humility, one host quipped to roaring laughter. Another joked that Crockett's words had broken the internet and possibly the Senate Wi-Fi. Yet beneath the memes and applause, something more profound was taking root. Viewers weren't just entertained, they felt awakened. Crockett's takedown exposed the brittle foundation beneath Scott's polished rhetoric, revealing the gap between speeches about opportunity and votes that block it. It wasn't simply a viral clip, it was a rare moment when political theater gave way to truth, and truth won. Political strategists took notice. Pundits debated whether this would embolden other progressive lawmakers to challenge Republican narratives more directly. Conservative commentators warned that Scott's stumble could haunt GOP messaging well into the next election season. One veteran analyst summed it up on a Sunday panel: "This wasn't just a debate. It was a narrative shift." Crockett showed that calm conviction can dismantle decades of spin in a single afternoon. As night fell, the energy showed no sign of slowing. Donations to grassroots causes spiked. Hashtags remained locked in Twitter's top trends into the next day. And Jasmine Crockett, back in her office surrounded by staff and supporters, quietly scrolled through the tidal wave of messages pouring in. Among them were notes from immigrants, working mothers, and young voters thanking her for speaking the truth when it mattered most. This was no fleeting meme. It was the crystallization of a new political reality: authenticity beating polish, courage outlasting calculation. And as strategists on both sides pored over the numbers and pundits parsed every line, one question hung over Washington like a storm cloud: what will this mean for 2025, when the country decides who truly represents its future? When the lights dimmed and the echo of Jasmine Crockett's words finally settled, something larger than a political exchange remained suspended in the air. It wasn't just that a freshman congresswoman had dismantled a seasoned senator, it was that she had reminded an entire nation of the power of dignity over ego, of truth over theatrics. Crockett's final remarks didn't gloat, didn't spike the ball, didn't even linger on her own victory. Instead, she turned the spotlight outward, toward the people who had fueled her rise and the values that gave her strength. "This chamber is not a stage for egos," she told reporters afterward. "It is a place where the lives of real families are decided. We cannot afford to confuse showmanship with service." Her words carried the quiet conviction of someone who understands that lasting change begins not with a headline, but with a heartbeat. For millions watching, the lesson was unmistakable. In a political era dominated by viral quips and relentless spin, Crockett had proven that courage is still contagious. She demonstrated that a single, well-aimed question rooted in moral clarity and delivered without malice can pierce even the thickest armor of power. No shouting. No insults. Just an unshakable truth. Across social media, supporters echoed the deeper meaning of the moment. "This isn't about left or right," one viral post read. "It's about someone finally standing up for the people who can't afford lobbyists." Teachers shared the clip with students as an example of civic bravery. Parents replayed it for their children as proof that integrity can still win in public life. The hashtags had started as memes, but they quickly became rallying cries for a country hungry for authentic leadership. Crockett herself credited those who rarely make headlines, the organizers, the single parents, the immigrant families who refuse to give up on the promise of America. "Every time you raise your voice, every time you vote, every time you tell your story," she said in a follow-up interview, "you chip away at the walls that divide us. That is where real power lives." The message resonated far beyond the Capitol. People who had grown cynical about politics felt a flicker of possibility. Viewers who had never donated, volunteered, or even voted before began to imagine that their participation might matter. Civic groups reported a surge in sign ups for local meetings. Voter registration links shared alongside the clip saw a spike in traffic overnight. Crockett's moment had become more than a clash of personalities, it had become a call to action. And in that call lay the true resolution of the day's drama. Tim Scott's polished rhetoric might fade from memory. But the values Crockett championed, justice, compassion, representation, would linger. Her victory was not simply over a senator, it was over the quiet despair that tells ordinary Americans their voices are too small to matter. The story will live on as proof that entrenched power is not invincible, that a single act of fearless honesty can ripple outward to inspire millions. Crockett's composure, her insistence on dignity even in confrontation, turned a political skirmish into a national reminder: America's future is not decided by the loudest performer, but by the bravest participant. As the nation looked ahead to 2025, the takeaway was clear. Change does not wait for permission. It waits for courage. And courage begins wherever anyone dares to stand, speak, and demand that truth be heard. And so the moment that began with a single sharp attack ended with something far greater, a reminder that courage can still shake the halls of power. Jasmine Crockett's fearless stand didn't just silence a senator, it reignited a belief that truth, spoken with dignity, can cut through even the thickest political fog. Her calm precision proved what our title promised: when arrogance meets integrity, integrity wins. But this story isn't only about what happened in that chamber. It's about what happens next, and that depends on all of us. Every share, every comment, every conversation keeps the spark alive. When you spread this clip, you're not just amplifying a viral moment, you're sending a message that justice matters, that representation matters, that the voices of everyday Americans cannot be ignored. So if this showdown moved you, don't stop watching. Right arrow share this video with friends who need to feel the power of truth. Right arrow comment below with your thoughts on what courage looks like in today's politics. Right arrow subscribe and stay with us as we track the ripple effects leading into 2025, because this is only the beginning. Remember the line that now echoes far beyond the chamber: because when one voice speaks truth, the whole room listens. Let that be your call to action. Your vote, your voice, your courage, it all counts. The next seismic moment could come from anywhere, even from you.